Good evening. Welcome to our discussion of Kant's philosophy. This is Unit 13. Again, as always, if you take your study sheet, you'll find it down underneath the video in the D2L unit for Kant. Just a brief comment or two before we begin tonight. The first thing I want you to note is that this is a brief overview of some of the major elements in Kant's philosophy. Kant is one of the great philosophers of Western philosophy. He is one of the giants, prolific in writing, insightful, and sometimes quite complex in the distinctions and discussions that he has. What's going to be important for me to remind you first and foremost is that he is very much a successor to the work of Locke and Hume in particular. You'll recall where Locke left us after our discussion of the British empiricists, that we had no theoretical or, if you like, epistemological certain knowledge of substance or causation. Issues of deep concern to Kant, who was very concerned to find ways of justifying Newtonian science and mathematics, and as a result of that was very deeply concerned with how to restore sound justifications for scientific knowledge. I'll give you a little summary from our previous discussions of where we came to that point. And as always, I've given you a slide here summarising all the things you need to learn. And again, the study sheet will help you to keep track of that as we're going through our discussion today. Take note of the points so that you can work out the answers to the questions so you won't get lost. There's a great deal of detail, even in a summary of Immanuel Kant. So please take note of the study sheet and let it help you. All right, let us just take note of some contributions Kant made. You are assigned the reading that of Kant's work called What is Enlightenment? You'll remember that he then set forth a thesis about reason governing particularly religious life as it expresses itself in the state. And quite a very important piece of legislation, but it was also one that was a product of the time, great disruption in Europe leading up to and the French Revolution. Europe was very splintered as far as countries were concerned, although the Prussian Empire was the dominant group in the north of Europe, France in the south, England and Spain. Nonetheless, there are the mighty powers. You don't discount the Dutch or others in the area. So it was a complex time, both religiously and philosophically. Kant's desire to deal with rationalism and empiricism, in a sense, bring them together, while working out of the empiricist model and building upon the work of people like David Hume. His, of course, key work is the concept of a priori synthetic knowledge. This is something that we'll come to in our discussion today, and it's really a significant contribution. In fact, one might say it's at the heart of his thinking, especially to as far as his critique of theoretical reason is concerned. Kant contributed a great deal to the modernisation of logic, in a sense taking us beyond the traditional categories of Aristotle and his successors. Kant had an enormous contribution in the area of ethics, with his categorical imperative and the conditions under which you could have a moral imperative. And of course, his very famous moral argument for the existence of God. There were many other things as well, but there's some key ones for you to note as you are beginning to take some note about Kant. A few comments on his life. First, there's a great deal of creative thought has gone on around the life of Immanuel Kant. If you like, a kind of mythology. At a factual level, he was born in Prussia to a Lutheran family. He was brought up in the Pietist tradition. He was the fourth of 9 children. He had a solid education. and by the age of 16 he was enrolled in university. And at Königsberg, that's where he spent his entire career. It is not true that he never left the place. Some people say he never moved more than 20 miles from Kronenberg. That's not true. His father's death in 1746 interrupted his studies, but he was soon back committed to studying, researching, writing. He produced in the 1760s some important works on philosophy. I've listed some of them there for you. And by age 45, he was a full professor of logic and metaphysics at the university itself. Theoretically, that should have ushered in a period of great productivity, but instead there was a period of silence from 1776 until 1781, when he published the Critique of Pure Reason. This, again, part of the discussion, Kant himself said that it was on reading David Hume's work that it changed the direction of his thinking. He'd begun to consider that his life work was to be on metaphysics, and that shifted to, if you like, the study of epistemology. I've listed some other major works. There are three key ones as far as we're concerned here: the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, and the Critique of Judgment. We'll not get a chance to make our way through all of them, but we'll take pieces from a number of them. The French Revolution was a background aspect drop, if you will, which affected some of his work. In fact, there were moments where tension for him came because of the Prussian government's concern to ensure that they held the state together. The whole string of political events had some impact on him. However, he had poor health, and he died in 1804, he died a very famous, well-respected and well-known way outside his own community. Emil Dorsling's painting of Kant, which you see on the screen at the moment, gives an indication of him meeting with his friends. I've got listed under the painting some of the friends present. These are all famous people in the history of philosophy. He had a lot of friends, and there's a mythology about him that he lived a loner's life. He lived a life of excessive order, which reflected his Prussian mindset and background. Well, he certainly lived an orderly life. At least everything indicates that, and his writing is orderly. There's a mythology about his evening walk, that the people could set their clocks by the time Kant went for a walk in the afternoon. He lived alone and was a loner. This is not correct. And it's not correct that he never ventured more than 20 miles. Lots of interesting aspects about him. Anyway, let's turn now to his philosophy. And before we do so, let us make our way into his thinking, if we can, by taking account of his reactions to David Hume and the production of the Critique of Pure Reason. He was very impressed with David Hume's assertions about our perceptions, and hence he was convinced there was no way we could know the actual world around us. All we had were a perception of what was in front of us. And so he would describe that as the world before us as it seems to be. And the world is just the way we perceive it. In other words, we are locked in a world of perceptions. However, having said that, he cried out, I'm certain of some of the things which Hume called matters of fact. And that'll take us back to the Hume slides and our discussion of Hume. So he was faced with a limit upon what he could say about metaphysics. But he approaches metaphysics with the confidence there were some things that he did know. But how could he justify saying what he said he knew? Primarily, causation and substance, which David Hume had insisted, you could not have true epistemological knowledge of those matters. So he began to talk about, and I've given you the definition on the screen. He said, metaphysics must not talk about what exists, but instead about how it's perceived. In other words, his metaphysics had to fit within a world of perception. And there is beginning to be, even in that starting point, a significant shift in the way he does his discussion. He rejects the traditional metaphysical duality between the transcendent and the corporeal, and replaces it with a duality of his own, the noumena and the phenomena. The noumena being the nature of things in themselves, which we can't reach out to and know directly. Phenomena, the things as they appear to us in our perceptions. And of course, this is a very limiting concept. The role of reason, science, common sense are limited to the phenomenal world. And hence his metaphysics, as traditionally understood, the way Plato would discuss it, or Aristotle, was just impossible. But he was convinced there was a noumenal world, a real world, a world of things in themselves. But he went on to insist, along with Hume, that we don't have any pure concepts about the noumenal world. So there's a sense, a barrier. But he doesn't wish to end at that point. He wishes to go beyond that. And so he turns to epistemology, and he begins to change the fundamental approach to epistemology. The epistemological question in the past has been, in a sense, revolving around the question, can we know if there is certainty, preferably about X or Y? But he wants to either ask a much more abstract question. At first it might seem to be a skeptical question. How can we know there is certainty? He wants to know, what are the characteristics of being certain about anything? And hence his discussion is in a different direction. And so he effectively has a different way of looking at universals and universalism. Or put it another way, universals play a very different role in his thinking. Here, in a sense, he's not continuing the previous discussions about universals, but rather he's changing and replacing the question, what is a universal, with a different question. And he goes on to, what conditions must be met for there to be universal knowledge? And from that question, he's asking the question that there must be something that exists for us to say that there are, or some conditions that must exist for us to be able to say there's universal knowledge. What's his conclusion? Well, his conclusion is that all knowledge, scientific and moral, must be universal and necessary. In a sense, we can come back and redefine what is a universal. We can say, yeah, universal is such knowledge which is necessarily universal and logically, rationally necessary. And in the initial discussion of this, he begins to cite certain things that indicate universality and necessity. From mathematics, he takes the proposition 2 plus 2 equals 4. From natural science, he cites Newton's third law of motion. He had a very high regard of Newton's laws of motion and Newton's whole science, approach to science. From metaphysics, so he's got mathematics, natural science, now metaphysics. He cites the principle of causality. Everything must have a cause. Now we'll come back to these things. We talk about synthetic a priori judgments. But it's sufficient for us to get an idea that what he is doing is he's going to say, how can I find the conditions for which knowledge is both universal and necessary? His philosophy is referred to as transcendental idealism. And the bottom line is that the self, the transcendental ego, it constructs knowledge out of a sense, impressions, and from universal concepts called categories that it imposes upon them. There's a mouthful for you. Now that definition will become a little more clear to you as we go on and talk about the categories and talk about his whole approach to a priori synthetic statements. But at least you should know there is a definition of it. But be careful of the word transcendental. There's a sense in which we want to say it transcends. That's not quite what Kant means by transcendental. I mean, knowledge about our cognitive facility, that's the way we think with regard to objects, how objects are possible a priori. In other words, transcendental knowledge is before experience. It's not knowledge of actual objects. Perhaps Kant's own words will help us. I've quoted them at the bottom of the slide for you. I call all knowledge transcendental if it is occupied not with objects, but with the way we can possibly know objects, even before we experience them. That'll take us into the concepts of the categories of the mind. But before we get there, we need to talk about Kant's famous epistemological revolution, his Caperian revolution. Kant supposes that the only adequate response to the challenge of Hume, the one that Hume gave to epistemology, was a complete revolution, a completely new approach. A recognition that the appearance of the external world, in the sum, depends upon the position and movements of the observer. It's a revolution understanding of the meaning word experience. In other words, to this point, experience is what you touched, felt, and saw. That you had experience in relation to, I'm tapping the table here in front of me, in relation to this table. And in relation to that, Kant says, hitherto it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects. Experience is the way I touch and feel objects. So experience is based upon my senses interacting with the world around me. Objects and senses. Kant doesn't deny that we touch, feel, smell, taste, and that data goes into our mind, these perceptions that go into us. But what he wants to argue is that instead of the experience taking place out here as I touch, but rather the experience is actually a mental thing going inside my head. He says experience is dependent upon concepts. There's something inside my head that makes sense of the things my fingers feel, my ears perceive, I see with my eyes, and so on. And hence, experience is dependent upon concepts. He's turning the concept of experience around. Now, to move on, we need to make some distinctions. And sometimes people get totally lost in these, and we'll try to leave you a little summary of them. You've already been introduced to a priori and a posteriori when we did logic. A priori, before experience, a posteriori, after experience. And this is a description of the way we make judgments. We make them before we have an experience, or we make them after we have an experience. a priori comes before the senses, and it's basically judgments formed by reason alone. Whereas a posteriori, judgments are made on the basis of sense experience. Now, how do we make sense of a priori and a posteriori judgments? Well, how do we analyse them, make sense of them? Well, Kant says it's important to understand that what that means is that what happens is that we engage in an analytic process. And those analytic processes are made on the basis of a priori judgments. And there's another way we make. There's synthetic, in which we make judgments that, in a sense, make an inquiry of something else which informs us. For example, an statement is, an analytic judgment, I beg your pardon, is, all men are men. It is a statement which is true by definition. It is like 2 + 2 = 4. That's an analytic style of judgment. A synthetic judgment is one which gives us more information. Water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. Water, we know more about it now because it boils at 100 degrees centigrade. We are synthesizing the information into a total whole. And what's important about these two forms of judgment, just as I say with a priori and a posteriori, as we noticed in logic, is that analytic judgments, like a priori judgments, produce conclusions which are certain. They're either certain by definition or they're certain by necessity. Whereas a posteriori judgments or synthetic judgments produce results which are probable, or subject to verification, or subject to being established as wrong. Now, that's important because what Kant wants to do is he now wants to take synthetic judgments, which make up all the judgments basically of mathematics and science, as it works in the real world, as they work in the real world. And he wants to be able to look at them as having something of the character of a priori judgments and analytic judgments with very firm and sure conclusions. And to do that, he comes up with the concept of a priori synthetic judgments. He combines a priori and synthetic in some way. How does he do that? Well, it's the way he looks at things. And he argues that some a priori concepts, take for example 5 + 7 = 12, are presupposed by the very possibility of experience. In other words, to be able to say 5 + 7 = 12 presupposes there's something in experience which necessitates that statement. The senses, in a sense, add up the numbers, 5 + 7. And there's an experience that necessitates 5 + 7 being equal to 12. Now, Kant wants to say that most propositions of mathematics and geometry have this synthetic a priori characteristic to them. Why? Because they are built around the concept of time and space. So now we've got some categories that Kant is insisting come up a priori. In other words, by the very nature of being able to think, to make judgments, it is a priori necessary that you can know about, that you have an understanding or have a concept in your mind of substance, of causation, of space and time. They're built into you. You can't help but see the world that way. But then Kant goes on to say that in mathematics there are also analytic judgments. For example, the whole is greater than any of its parts. And that's necessarily so, both conceptually and in, if you like, our ability to make sense of the perceptions that we're getting as we experience the world. In natural science, he says certain propositions about natural science. Here, of course, he's talking about Newton, for example. And take, for example, Newton's laws. He said they have a semi-empirical concept behind them. They are built around space. Matter, for example, he says, defines as the movable that takes place in space. And, for example, every action, there is an equal and opposite action. Matter can either be created or destroyed. Now, I'm using some of the list of number of people put together, and you can see where I've taken those. Hopefully, you're starting to understand that what he's really saying here is that there are certain synthetic judgments which have an a priori character to them because our minds are designed with these sort of categories that give us a certainty about those experiences we're having. It's the way we can't help but perceive the world. And the question then is, well, where does he go with this synthetic a priori judgments? What's he going to do with this? Well, he's already established that knowledge, both scientific and moral, needs to be necessary and universal. And he says that these a priori judgments, we refer to them, that we really end up with intuiting in relation to them. The process by which we look at them is an intuition, which presents to the mind an object of sense, what the senses are perceiving. And we see them unit by unit by unit. And again, these are made in relation to space and time. And this space and time is not dependent upon any particular experience. It's just the way we see the world. Well, all right, so we are taking by intuition the sense data we're getting through our senses and is interacting with these. Well, how do we make sense of this? Well, he says the mind has two powers, sensibility and understanding. And all the stuff that goes into our mind through sensibility and understanding calls representations. And he wants to insist that intuition and concepts have to work hand in hand. And the reason he wants to say that is his famous concept here, or assertion. Concepts without perception empty, and precepts without concepts are blind. And probably that's as far as we need to go. I've given you some other into the mind. I think from our purposes here, at this point, we see he's beginning to unfold an understanding of how the mind works and how we come to know things. But now he's got to go back and he's got to say, okay, I've seen these a priori concepts of causation and substance and time and space. How do I account for all of thinking? And we're not going to go into all of that, but what we're going to simply do at this point in time is just address the a priori categories of the mind, how he puts them all together. He says, these pure concepts of the mind do not come from understanding. Again, he emphasizes experience is derived because of them or by means of them. It's the way the mind represents our perceptions of the world to the mind. So what then are the categories? Well, first and foremost, there's substance and causality. There are 10 others: space, time, quantity, quality, relation, space, place, position, possession, action, and passivity. By now you're probably seeing some hints of what other philosophers have done. You remember when Descartes dealt with his clear and distinct ideas, he was using mathematical approach, these quantifiable principles of science, if you will, or mathematics. Kant would be horrified that I drew a comparison between himself and Descartes, but these things are there, they're used repeatedly. And Kant wants to assert that with these 10 categories, you can define every possible form of predication, every kind of outcome using these categories to help you understand the perceptions you're receiving of the world. And of course, not only should you draw perhaps some interesting comparisons with Descartes, but also you can hear something of Aristotle's categories. You remember we began this course by giving one of the first assignments in the reading side was to read about the categories, Aristotle's categories, and I told you then these things would keep coming up. All right, let's move on from his epistemology, and let's now move on to the soul, perhaps the mind. He describes the soul as the thinking substance, as the principle of life in matter. It really has an echo of many previous definitions of the soul, does it not? And then he sets out the main functions of the primary functions. And I'll just highlight this because I think it's worthy. You see knowledge, desire, and feeling. And he writes his 3 major works: his critique of pure reason, his critique of practical reason, which deals with morality and ethics, and pleasure and discipline, his critique of judgment. So the soul, the mind, unity, he lists in this way. I'm trying to be careful not to take us too far, but to give you enough of, as you're reading through things, to be able to assemble some of the data. Some of you may be doing your essay on Kant and the soul. You may find the distinctions made between the primary facilities here and a second set of facilities. The first set dealing with function, the second set dealing with the epistemological analysis. But I'll leave it there for you. If you're writing and you're concerned about this, you can contact me. We're back now to the necessary conditions of moral imperative. This really takes us back to that previous discussion we had on universals. And of course, the bottom line is the bottom line. Knowledge, both scientific and moral, must be universal and necessary. So in other words, the necessary condition for a moral imperative, or the necessary conditions, is that those imperatives must be universal and they must be necessary. And of course, by necessary, we mean logically necessary. But before we look at his great categorical imperative, just a quick look at the concept of moral goodness. The first thing is that Kant has an objective or a conceptual standard for what's morally good. An action has moral worth if it's done out of duty. And an action does not derive moral worth from the purpose for which it's done, in other words, the motive, nor the goal for which is aimed, but rather by the moral duty from which the action is derived as an imperative. It depends upon the moral rule. Our actions and their effects as ends and incentives cannot give actions any unconditional and moral worth. Now this is very deontological. This is rule ethics to the max. And if we were going further in ethics, we'd have a long discussion about the nature of deontological ethics. But at this point, we do turn from his objective standard to the subjective outworking of that standard. He goes on to ask the question, what does that mean when it's applied to the individual? When have I exercised moral goodness in a particular action? And the answer is when my action was performed in accordance with both goodwill and moral duty. Now, moral goodness is not established at the subjective interval. And I'm not making up my own mind what I think and how it applies to me. I'm not establishing what goodwill is or moral duty is, but I can see whether I've exercised goodwill and moral duty. But rather, that goodwill and moral duty is established by a universal and necessary conceptual level of standards, which I've applied to myself. So, goodwill is the logical consistency between one's intention and one's action, and that consistency is a value on the basis of respect for the moral law. In other words, am I performing this act consistently for obedience and respect of the moral law and the moral law alone? Nothing else is goodwill. So the imperative here is to do good to all consistently based on a personal exploration of what would be the case if, and here comes the universal, if one's actions were extended to all humans in the same situation. In other words, I make a rule. Before I apply it, I answer the question, what would happen if this was applied to everybody? Example, if I said, it is a rule that I should kill every person who has red hair. Now, if I applied that to everyone in the world, I would have a situation which was, number one, unnecessary, and secondly, certainly couldn't be universalised. Can't be universalised. You rationally see that can't be the case. Kant would argue. Now, before we turn to his categorical imperative, we need to see a distinction. It's tied up with his concept of goodwill. The imperative is to do good to all consistently, based on a personal exploration of what would be the case if one's actions were extended to all human beings in all situations. However, Kant recognised that some imperatives may need to be conditional. For example, if I was to say to you, if you give me your new laptop computer, I'll give you $500. Now, it would be a universal imperative that people ought to keep their promises when seriously given and otherwise legal. However, the promise that I would be making in that statement to give $500 is conditional upon you giving me your computer. Hence, Kant would say it is hypothetical. And with that in mind, that takes us to his categorical imperative. And again, he's looking at the conditions upon which the imperative is built or established. He has three of them to start with. An action is moral if and only if the maxim on which it is based can be universalised. Going back to the previous slide, people have a moral duty to keep their promises, etc., under the appropriate conditions. Secondly, an action is moral if and only if it's carried out based on a freely imposed rule, autonomously achieved. An action is moral if and only if it treats people or persons as an end in themselves and not as a means to an end. And so with that in mind, we come up with this summary of his categorical imperative. Act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Act on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now there's a bit of a fun discussion here in the cartoon, which ends up with Kant and his moral imperative as he deals with discussion between, well, I'll leave you to look at the cartoon and sort it through for yourself. You can see a whole discussion about the hypothetical and categorical flowing through this cute little cartoon. Well, let me round this off by bringing us back to what you need to know for the course. You have the summary here. You have this study sheet for you. I hope that's helpful to you. Please make sure you make your way through and prepare for the tests. And please understand that this discussion of Kant today has been the conclusion of this introductory course, taking us from the pre-Socratics through to Kant. And it rests as a kind of general introduction to more advanced levels in philosophy, where you begin afresh with Kant, either studying Kant in detail or studying Kant in relation to some of his successors. That's the purpose of giving you these technical items, so you can have some of those differences and hopefully prepare you for as you move on, as I hope you might move on in the study of philosophy. Well, thank you for your attention. Thank you for watching, and have a good night.